We're broadcasting from the Middle Tennessee Electric Studios. Visit MTE.com.
From the WGNSradio.com News Center, a local news update.
This is WGNS News.
Since 1947.
1947.
WGNS Action Line. Now your host, Scott Walker.
Today, we're talking with MTSU graduate Nyasaina Kwamboka. She found herself captivated by hydroelectric dams, wind turbines, and renewable energy systems that she encountered growing up in Kenya. Tell us more about that.
Growing up, we had a lot of exposure to different types of energy, and this was by virtue of our education. We would take a lot of field trips to hydroelectric power dams, and when you're driving in Nairobi, you get to see these huge wind turbines in the Ngong Hills. And back at home on our farm, we had DIY solar panels and biogas as well for heating and for cooking. And so I was genuinely fascinated by how we could use the various elements of the earth to generate electricity and heat. So that's something that's always fascinated me.
Do-it-yourself solar panels. That's interesting. Were they on the tops of houses? What did they do?
Essentially, a DIY solar panel would come in a kit. It has a whole manual that you can put together. Like they will show you this is the pin where you put onto the solar panel and you stick it above the roof. And it also came with a little bulb. And essentially, we would put these onto the lower lying roofs within our home or down there by the village schools. And we would just connect the electricity. It was honestly quite an interesting process. It also was not dangerous because the electrical force was not strong enough to harm you, but it was strong enough to provide light and electricity.
And then also Dr. Christabel Devados, professor of geography at MTSU. Dr. Devados, how does all of this fit in to everything happening at MTSU, and where do you come into play?
Nyasaina had worked with me on a research project over the last year, and my work actually focuses more on looking at experiences of racialized minorities in rural Rust Belt areas, specifically how they face impacts of climate change. So that's kind of where my work fits in, and so we kind of overlapped in that way. And Nyasaina, I'll let you talk a little bit more if you'd like about some of the stuff that you did.
Tell us what you did, what you researched, and how you went about it.
As an economist and environmental researcher, I've been very inclined to environmental issues happening in rural areas and urban areas. And when I got the opportunity to work with Dr. Devados, we were looking at climate labor and community resilience in the rural Rust Belt. My work was mostly focused on ecological intelligence and trying to break down the various interviews that Dr. Devados had carried out with various participants across the rural Rust Belt. And the main goal was to try and find qualitative and quantitative data on environmental justice, biodiversity change, community resilience, public health. And then I synthesized these interview findings into thematic documents and broke down this environmental intelligence to try and find more information that was suitable with geographic information systems and spatial research. And all of this accumulated into contributing to a book chapter where we wrote alongside some really great scholars on environmental progress and environmental change in rural areas.
At MTSU, Ms. Kwamboka, you focused your graduate research on advancing geopolitical energy sovereignty and human security through geothermal energy in East Africa's Rift Valley. Tell us about that and how that ties in to what you did at MTSU.
My research on energy, of course, stems from my childhood background, my interest in energy, but it also stems from my undergraduate research where I did a practicum report on geothermal energy. Now, at that time, my research was not as advanced as it is right now, But when I came to MTSU, I found that I could continue doing global energy research in alignment with my master's program. And what geothermal energy is, it's energy that is sourced from the Earth's core. And I had the opportunity to visit the Menengai geothermal station in Kenya last year with a few colleagues. And with that, we got to understand the technical aspect of geothermal energy. However, when it came to the geopolitical aspect and policy on human security, that wasn't necessarily something that a lot of the engineers were covering. And so I knew that it was an opportunity to look into what the East African community that does not have a lot of access to electricity. Actually, it's one of the least electrified regions in the world, but there is a base load of 20,000 megawatts worth of energy within the East African rift system that has not been tapped into. And majority of the reason why a lot of this electricity has not been tapped into is because there are a lot of regional diplomacy infrastructure that's lacking, some humanitarian displacement as well. And we also looked into the issue of biological insecurity, like, for example, in Uganda, where we have these geothermal sites, there are unique biodiversity such as gorillas. And to tap into this electricity would force us to, relocate gorillas, which are a very unique species. So it's a really interesting region of the world to focus on how we could produce more electricity for these regions and provide more human security to the people living within this area. And this ties into the work that I did here at MTSU in the sense that it supported the international perspective and the global perspective of human security and energy access. But it also gave me an opportunity to use that background knowledge to understand that a lot of the times when you're looking into environmental issues in rural areas, the best way to find out information about this is by speaking to the people on the ground, which is what Dr. Devados was doing within the Rust Belt area. And that's something that really drew me to use my skills to contribute to the research here at MTSU.
If I'm not mistaken, you had some of the research recommended by the National Science Foundation. Is that correct?
It was recommended. It was NSF Early Career Award. So it was recommended. It basically made it through all the levels. And then unfortunately, at the very last step, got doged given the content. So we did not get the funding. We had it all proportioned out. So yeah, it would have been a longer, more in-depth project. But you can definitely say it was recommended. It went through peer review multiple times. It was recommended up to the highest level. It just was unfortunate, the political timing of when it was going to be approved. It was in the first couple of weeks of 2025. But we did continue doing the research, and Nyasaina was really significant to that. The interviews that I did, I still was able to do because I actually grew up in the rural Rust Belt as a racialized minority. So some of the issues and things that we were looking at, I had firsthand experience with. I think that made it kind of easier to still go on with the project. And of course, it was still supported by our department, and that has been really helpful in carrying forward with the project.
Kind of walk us through the focus of the NSF. It was proposed, it was recommended to NSF.
Yeah, it was recommended. It went through peer review, it was recommended. I had been told actually that it had never happened in the history of the administration where it had been recommended at that level and then not awarded. So this was like new territory for them. But it was an NSF Early Career Award, which is like one of the hardest NSF awards to get. So there was some definitely merits to the project. It was, unfortunately, informed speculation was that some of the keywords were flagged, including the word racialized, climate change. Those things were flagged by AI. I think it went through AI is my understanding potentially. And because of that, it was just not awarded. I think in any other year it would have been awarded. I think when Doge came in,
there's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on. Just was very bad timing. Had it happened the year before, it would have been funded. Had it happened any year before 2025, it would have been funded. The grant was for $540,000.
Dr. Devados, kind of tell us, how did a native of Kenya adapt to analyzing qualitative data and then interviewing rural communities in the U.S. Midwest? I mean, how did all that kind of unfold?
Yeah, so I did the interviews. I would conduct the interviews and then I would share them, and then Nyasaina would do the qualitative kind of analysis part of it, so the transcription and then some of the coding. Yeah, and I think, given her experience and what she had done before, it's just basically, talking to people just on the other side of the world, but some of the principles are the same, right? So if you're thinking about interviewing people and you're thinking about community-based, community-driven kind of collaborative work, I think it can be the same whether it's in Kenya or in rural Ohio or rural Michigan. I think the principles of that are the same. And I think, her perspective was really, really beneficial.
Dr. Christabel Devados, professor of geography at MTSU.
I'm happy that she's graduated, but of course I will miss her and her contributions to the work, and hopefully we can continue to collaborate. Again, she's going to be on a book chapter with me and some other faculty, interdisciplinary researcher in biology, and also we have another colleague in sociology. So I think it's been just a really great experience.
Are there maybe one or two different things that y'all discovered between the energy and the climate issues in rural America versus rural East Africa that kind of overlap?
I'll let you kind of handle that, Nyasaina. I didn't do the work that you did in East Africa, so maybe you have some pointers, but I don't. There's definitely some overlap.
MTSU graduate, Nyasaina Kwamboka. What overlapped?
Absolutely. There were two primary overlaps that I saw between the communities in East Africa and the Rust Belt area as well in rural America. And the first thing had to do with green theory, and it looked into how a lot of people, these are people in the civil society, they truly do have a frontline observation on the environmental problems that are happening in a very specific way that somehow supersedes what government intelligence would have or scientific satellite data would be able to collect. So, for instance, in rural America, there were people who were talking about the environmental intelligence of identifying how a specific type of bird called a killdeer bird was disappearing, right? They had not seen one of them in about a decade. And another person was talking about how there were a lot of silkworms that were disappearing. And these were people who were living within the frontline communities. And they had lived within the Rust Belt area for a specific amount of time. So as an environmental researcher, this made me very excited because when I looked back at the work that I did in East Africa and specifically in Kenya, northern Kenya, we were talking to some women who were experiencing water scarcity, and they were quite literally explaining what all of that looks like. Or whenever I was talking to people that were working on the front lines of the energy sites, they would explain that perhaps the quality of the water around the energy sites was changing or it was being depleted. And that was quite fascinating because some of these specific bits and pieces of data, a lot of the times the government or the satellite images are not necessarily looking for this information because they don't live at the front lines. And then another really interesting thing was that civil society does identify a lot of problems, but at the same time, there's also unequal power relations, like historical patterns of exclusion or economic constraints. For example, within the rural America, there were some disenfranchised communities that would have higher electricity prices or higher AC prices compared to affluent areas that had more tree canopies that would reduce the cost of heating prices or energy prices within their homes. And then when we looked at other regions in Eastern Africa, specifically in Kenya, we would see how there was also a fragmentation on how marginalized people would receive access to electricity versus people who lived in urban areas had more access to electricity, when in reality, these energy sites were actually stationed in regions where there was a lot of energy poverty, but the electricity would be transported to the affluent areas. And so when we look at these ideologies, we get to understand that it doesn't matter what the national boundaries look like or the state boundaries look like. At the end of the day, it's all about who controls the resources and who gets to benefit from them and who is excluded. And so this is a really interesting perspective to look into when it comes to major decision-making roles of energy or climate change, etc. There's always going to be perspectives and complex societal norms that perhaps exclude some people and include other people.
This project focused on comparing the Rust Belt with portions of Kenya. And the Rust Belt is an industrial region located across the Great Lakes and Midwestern parts of the U.S. Some of the key states include Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, plus the western and northern parts of New York and Wisconsin, all under the Rust Belt. And it's because of the past industry. The area was once the heart of American steelmaking, coal mining, and car manufacturing. And it got that name, the Rust Belt, in the 1970s and 80s, because factories were closing down and beginning to rust. As modern growth moved in, the manufacturing cities of yesterday were closing down. Kenya, of course, is not a post-industrial Rust Belt, but a developing economy focused heavily on agriculture, service sectors, and emerging technology. And Kenya's economic challenges are focused on building up domestic manufacturing, infrastructure development, and integrating a very young demographic into the workforce, as opposed to managing the decline of an old heavy industry peak. But it's the rural Kenyan area that reveals a study that's more about contrasting economic shifts through systematic marginalization, the younger generation moving out, and a reliance on older economic models. The rural Kenyan area focuses more heavily on small-scale agriculture farming and livestock. Its economic challenges stem from shifting weather patterns, limited access to large capital, and infrastructure gaps that are major, rather than the collapse of the heavy industrial factories like we're seeing in the area described as the Rust Belt in the U.S. I'm curious, if you were to look at electric prices for rural America versus places in Kenya, I mean, it sounds like in rural areas of Kenya, there is no electricity, so they have to figure out ways to power themselves in some parts of the country. Is that right? What have you all found?
We didn't collect, we're not collecting at this point, raw numbers of electricity bills. That is something we may do in the future. But I think the sentiment there is still that, kind of what Nyasaina spoke to. It's more that energy is not necessarily regulated in the same way. And of course, it matters depending on the state, the locality. The pricing depends on where you live. And so there's a lot of different factors which make it kind of challenging to paint an overall picture, at least in rural Rust Belt areas. But one of the other things I think that could be potentially compared is the lack of electricity or the lack of reliable electricity, because a lot of times when you have official data, when you're not in a frontline community, you may not know that, the power goes out a lot. There are certain areas in certain regions where people do not have reliable power. I can't speak to Kenya, but my father's family is from India, and some of the things I see in villages in India with respect to reliable power, like the power will go out certain times of the day. Sometimes they'll do planned power outages, and they don't necessarily do that here in rural Ohio, but the electricity in some places is almost, I would say, maybe not even like it might be the same level of reliability that you would see in rural India and some parts of rural Midwest, rural Rust Belt. And I don't know if that's kind of what you were seeing as well.
It almost sounds like in some parts of developed countries, even in the U.S. and in Kenya, As far as utilities go, it's almost like third world electricity usage or electric being provided. It's almost like a third world country within developed countries.
Yeah, I would say, in parts of, consider like the global north and the global south, I would say that some of that might be similar. I mean, and you might not think that about parts of the United States, but there are a lot of places in the U.S. that face challenges when it comes to access to electricity and access to educational infrastructure or just infrastructure in general. I can say that there are parts of rural Ohio I've been to, including, where I grew up, where I have less reliable access to internet than I do in parts of rural India when I visit my family there. So, I think sometimes these stereotypes that we have about, people in places like, oh, this is what it's like here, this is what it's like here, can be maybe not the most accurate and can also kind of prevent us from dealing with the challenges that people, like everyday people, deal with on the ground. And so I think that's kind of the importance of doing this kind of research, is trying to get those voices and communities, issues out there.
While the Rust Belt area retains roads, power grids, and water systems built for a much larger industrial population, much of it is now aging and often underfunded. Kenya, on the other hand, the rural area of Kenya, faces the problem of developing infrastructure, and there's an ongoing transition of finding reliable electricity. And the internet, well, it's still nearly unheard of in some parts of rural Kenya. What's the next step with some of the research that was done?
We're still going to work together a little bit after this. It would be great in the future to continue collaborating. For this research now, I think some of the main field work is done, but there are still some of the quantitative data that we are still collecting. There are still some of the geospatial data that we are going to continue collecting, and then kind of synthesizing that and then thinking about how to present that information publicly, not just in academic journals. Of course, there will be, academic publications out of this, but really trying to get this information out there and trying to change the narrative of rural places and, the experiences of rural people. People that live in these communities, aren't always associated with the stereotypes that you might see, in movies or national media or even, political discourse, that there's a rich variety of experiences and a rich diversity and variety of people. And so that's kind of our next step is thinking about how to kind of change that narrative more broadly and maybe even nationally.
And then, Ms. Kwamboka, are you in the U.S.? Do you live here or did you go back to Kenya?
I'm currently in the United States right now, and I'm going to continue being here while I continue contributing to Dr. Devados's research. And what I also wanted to add in is that the energy aspect of this research is really just one grain of sand on the beach, because we collected multiple thematic areas to focus on, such as access to proper air quality or environmental justice, public health, biodiversity loss, and land decision, and environmental injustice or community resilience, industrial agriculture, etc. And so there are so many facets of the environment that we have the opportunity to analyze and get into. And so this is definitely going to be an ongoing project.
Yeah, many years. I would agree with that. I started this research in 2020. And so I imagine I don't see an end to this because there are so many things to look into, right? There's so many different facets of this topic that I don't necessarily see a stopping point in that sense.
And is there a website or something where people can learn more about all this?
Maybe not yet, but that is a really good idea. We could create something like that. There's a couple journal publications I did prior to working with Nyasaina that kind of laid the groundwork for this. And then there's 1 or 2 story maps, RGIS story maps out there. But we'll have a couple more, hopefully within the next year, that we can put out there.
And I could add in one more thing. If anyone's interested in learning more about environmental research in Africa, we actually do have a website where we publish our research. It's called the African Environmental Youth Advisory.org. And if anyone's interested in reading about what's happening on the other side of the planet, then that's always available for people to view.
Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.